The first sign came from a sensor array that nobody was supposed to be watching. The Keth Consortium had built their deep-range monitoring station in the Verath Expanse about 300 years ago, back when they still thought there might be something interesting out there worth watching. There never was. The Expanse was a wide, cold stretch of space between star systems, full of nothing but old light and drifting gas. Nobody went there. Nobody had a reason to. The station ran on its own, recorded its data, and sent packets back to the consortium every 90 days. Most of those packets went unread. Analyst Saren Voss had been assigned to the Verath Monitoring Station review because she had made the mistake of finishing her work early on a Tuesday. Her supervisor noticed she had nothing to do and gave her the backlog. 6 months of unread data packets. She was supposed to sort them, flag anything odd, and file the rest. She was on her 4th packet when she found it. At first she thought it was a sensor error. The reading showed an object moving through the outer expanse at a velocity that made no sense. She ran the calibration check twice. The sensors were fine. She ran the math again. The numbers were the same. The object was real. It was moving, and it was moving in a way that should not have been possible given what it was made of. She flagged it and sent a message to her supervisor. Her supervisor forwarded it to the department head. The department head looked at the numbers for a long time and then forwarded it upward without comment. It moved up the chain quickly after that, the way things do when nobody wants to be the person who ignored something important. Within 48 hours, the readings had reached the Senior Science Council of the Keth Consortium. By then, 2 other things had also happened. The Vorath hegemony had picked up the same object on their long-range arrays, and they had not shared this information with anyone. And the Shul Collective, oldest of all the spacefaring peoples in this part of the galaxy, had been watching the object for 11 days already. They had not shared their information either. The object was a ship. This alone was not strange. Ships moved through space all the time. The Keth had ships. The Vorath had ships. The Shul had ships that had been traveling between stars since before the Keth had discovered fire. Ships were not unusual. What was unusual was this particular ship. It was small, for one thing. Not Scout-class small, which was still a serious piece of engineering. This was smaller than that. The Keth analysts who studied the sensor returns could not quite believe what they were measuring. The vessel was roughly cylindrical, slightly asymmetrical, in a way that suggested the builders had been working with limited materials and had made adjustments as they went. The hull showed signs of repair in at least 4 places. Different sections of the outer plating had slightly different surface temperatures, which meant they had been replaced at different times. The propulsion signature was chemical at the rear, and something else at the front, something the analysts could not immediately identify but which was clearly not the same technology as the main drive. It looked, in other words, like a ship that had been built by people who were doing their best with what they had. The velocity was what made no sense. The Keth had a classification system for starship drives. It had taken them roughly 4 centuries to develop, and it covered every propulsion method they had encountered across 200 years of contact with other civilizations. At the low end were the chemical drives, which were mostly historical curiosities. You could not cross the distance between stars with a chemical drive. The math simply did not work. The distances were too great, and the energy requirements were too high. Everyone knew this. It was not a matter of debate. It was a fact about the universe. The object in the Verath Expanse had a chemical drive signature, and it had traveled 4.3 light-years in 11 months. The Senior Science Council sat in their chamber and looked at this information for a long time. Several of them requested that the data be re-verified. It was re-verified. The numbers stayed the same. One council member suggested there might be a secondary drive system that the sensors had missed. This was possible. The analysts went back to look. They found traces of what might have been a secondary system, but the output it would have produced was still not enough to account for the velocity. Not even close. Another council member, a very old woman named Adept Chithara Lin, who had spent 60 years in deep space analysis, said quietly that she thought they were looking at something she had heard about in theoretical papers, but never expected to see. The other council members waited for her to explain. She said she thought the ship might be using an emergent drive method, something developed from first principles by a civilization that had not had access to any of the established technologies and had therefore gone looking for a different path. The room was quiet after she said this, because what it meant, if she was right, was that whoever had built this ship had started from nothing and found a way to the stars anyway. The Vorath hegemony's response to the same data was different. The Vorath were military by nature. Not aggressive exactly, but structured. They thought in terms of strength and weakness, capability and threat, known and unknown. When Admiral Keth Saros saw the initial report on the object in the expanse, his first question was not what it was made of, or how it worked. His first question was where it was going. His analysts plotted the trajectory. The ship was moving in a straight line, which was itself interesting. Most ships in transit made course corrections, adjusted for gravity wells, followed established lanes. This one was going in a straight line from its point of origin to its destination, with no detours and no adjustments. It had come from a star system called Sol. The Vorath had minimal records on Sol. It was listed in the Galactic Survey as a single star system, with several planetary bodies, no detected spacefaring civilization, and a note that the third planet showed biological activity of unknown complexity. The survey was 200 years old. Nobody had followed up. The destination of the ship appeared to be the Keth border station, at Relay Point Veron, which was the nearest inhabited outpost to the expanse on the far side. The Admiral read this, and sat back in his chair. The ship was not approaching in any known formation. It was not signaling ahead. It was not following any diplomatic approach corridor, of which there were several well-established ones. It was also not approaching in a way that suggested military intent, which would have looked different, more cautious, more tactical. It was approaching, as far as Admiral Keth Saros could determine, the way you approach something when you simply want to get there, and you have decided that this is the most direct way to do it. He found this more unsettling than any military approach would have been. A military approach he would have known how to read. This, he did not. He ordered a Vorath monitoring vessel to the region and told them to observe, but not engage. He sent a private message to his contact at the Keth Consortium, suggesting that they might want to compare notes. The Keth replied within hours. Yes, they had seen it. Yes, they were watching. No, they did not know what to make of it either. The Shul Collective said nothing to anyone. This was not unusual for the Shul. They had been in space for so long that most of the other civilizations had stopped expecting them to explain themselves. The Shul watched and thought and occasionally acted in ways that became clear only much later. Their Elder Council had been monitoring the ship from Sol since it first appeared on the edge of detectable space, which was 11 days before anyone else noticed it. The Elder who had first flagged the object was named Thought in Long Arcs, which was how the Shul named their wisest members. She had watched the ship for 3 of those 11 days before she called a meeting of the senior elders. She showed them the data without comment and waited. The elders studied it. Several of them conferred in the quiet, layered way the Shul communicated, which was not quite speech, and not quite silence, but something in between. Thought in Long Arcs waited. She had already reached her own conclusions, and she wanted to know if the others would reach the same ones. Eventually, the eldest of the elders, who was known simply as the one who has waited, spoke. He said, "This is a very young ship, from a very young people." Thought in Long Arcs agreed. He said, "They should not be here yet." She agreed with this too. He said, "And yet here they are." There was a long silence after that, the kind of silence that means many things are being considered at once. Then, the one who has waited said something that Thought in Long Arcs would think about for a long time afterward. He said, "I want to know what their world looked like when they left it. I want to know what it cost them to get here." She did not have that information yet, but she began looking. On the ship itself, none of this was happening. On the ship, which was called the Uns Persistence, a junior crew member named Tomas Arriaga was losing a card game to the ship's medic, a woman named Dr. Yuki Sato, who insisted she had no idea how to play cards, but who had now won 11 hands in a row. The Persistence had a crew of 22. They were 43 days out from their last checkpoint, which had been a small automated relay buoy that humanity had placed 3 years earlier as part of the first deep space survey mission. The buoy had given them a course confirmation and a data packet from home. The data packet was 11 months old by the time they received it, because of how light and distance worked, but the crew had read it anyway. There were letters from families, an update on the world news, and a message from the mission director reminding them that they were making history. The crew had read the mission director's message and then gone back to work. The Persistence was not a beautiful ship. Commander Yael Okafor, who had been its captain for 3 years, had stopped apologizing for this approximately 2 years and 11 months ago. The ship had been built to a budget and a timeline that had required compromises. Some of those compromises were visible in the slightly uneven hull plating on the port side, where the original material had not been available and a substitute had been used. Some were visible in the engineering section, where 2 of the 4 secondary coolant lines ran along the ceiling instead of through the walls because there had not been enough time to route them properly before launch. Some were audible in the particular hum the main drive made at 73% thrust, which was not supposed to be there but which the crew had learned to work around. What the ship did have, which was the thing that mattered, was a working Alcubierre adjacent drive system. Commander Okafor had stopped calling it Alcubierre adjacent because the theoretical physicists back home insisted the term was imprecise. The engineers on the ship called it the bubble because that was what it made around the vessel, a small region of distorted space that let the Persistence move through the universe at a speed the surrounding universe found unreasonable. The bubble was not elegant. It was not efficient. It used more power than any other system on the ship combined, and it required recalibration every 48 hours. And twice, it had simply stopped working, for reasons that took the engineering team several days to figure out. But it worked. It had carried 22 humans across 4.3 light-years of empty space in 11 months, and in 43 more days it was going to bring them to the edge of what humanity's long-range sensors suggested was a region of space with a lot of interesting signals in it. Nobody on the Persistence knew that those signals came from 3 separate civilizations that had all noticed their ship and were currently trying to decide what to do about it. Tomas Arriaga lost his last hand to Dr. Sato and pushed away from the table. He walked to the small observation port at the rear of the crew quarters and looked out at the stars. They looked the same as they always did. Steady, cold, very far away. He had grown up in a city where you could not see many stars because of the light pollution, and the first time he had seen the full sky from space he had stood at this same port for an hour just looking. He was past that now, but he still looked sometimes. He thought about the fact that somewhere out there, between those lights, there might be people, other kinds of people. His grandmother had believed this firmly. She had told him when he was small that the universe was too large to be empty, and that someday humans would find out what filled it. He had believed her then. He still believed her now, in a less simple way. He did not know, standing at that port, that on 3 separate ships and in 2 separate council chambers, various kinds of people were looking at data about the Persistence and asking each other urgent questions. He did not know that the Keth Consortium was preparing a diplomatic vessel. He did not know that a Vorath monitoring ship had just received orders to move into observation range. He did not know that the oldest living member of the Shul Collective was sitting in silence trying to understand what kind of world could have produced a ship like this. He just looked at the stars. Then Dr. Sato called from the table and asked if he wanted to play another hand, and he said yes. Back in the Keth Council chamber, the debate had shifted. They had moved past the question of what the ship was, and were now on the harder question of what to do about it. This was complicated by the fact that the Keth did not know anything about the people on the ship. They had records on most spacefaring civilizations. They had diplomatic histories, contact protocols, cultural assessments, known sensitivities and preferences. For the people from Sol, they had none of this. The file on Sol was nearly empty. 3rd planet, biological activity. No contact record. Someone had sent a junior researcher to find whatever they could on the Sol system. She came back with very little. The star was a yellow dwarf, middle-aged, stable. The 3rd planet was in the habitable zone. The biological activity detected 200 years ago had turned out to be a complex ecosystem with a dominant species. The dominant species had, apparently at some point in the last 2 centuries, developed technology. Spaceflight had been detected roughly 300 years ago, which in galactic terms was extremely recent. There were radio signals, a lot of them. The researcher had translated a sample. The sample was mostly entertainment broadcasts, music, something that looked like dramatic performances, news of local events. There was also a significant amount of what appeared to be argument. Adept Chathara Lin looked at the translation sample for a long time. She said, "They have had spaceflight for 312 years. The room was quiet. 312 years was nothing. The Keth had been in space for 9,000 years. the Vorath for 7,000, the Shul for so long that their own records of when they started were incomplete. A civilization 300 years into spaceflight was practically newborn. They should not have been able to cross interstellar distances. They should not have had a ship that could do what the Persistence was doing. They should, by every reasonable measure, have been a local species, still feeling their way around their own solar system. Adept Chathara Lin set down the translation sample. She said, "I would very much like to know what else they have managed to figure out in 300 years. She did not say this with fear. She said it with the particular tone of someone who has just realized that the universe is more interesting than they thought it was. The meeting continued. Plans were made. A Herald-class diplomatic vessel was prepared. Contact protocols were assembled. Translators were assigned. Nobody slept well that night. In the Vorath monitoring ship, Admiral Keth Saros's representative watched the Persistence on their sensors. The ship moved steadily. It did not vary its course. It did not slow down. It went where it was going with the calm, even pace of something that had decided to go there, and was simply doing so. The Vorath officer who was watching the sensors had been in the monitoring corps for 12 years. She had watched a lot of ships. She had watched military vessels and trade ships and diplomatic cruisers and survey probes. She had a good sense for what a ship's movement said about the people on it. She watched the Persistence for a while. Then she wrote in her log, "This ship moves like it belongs here. It does not know it is being watched. It does not care. It is going somewhere and it is going there. And nothing about its movement suggests it has considered the possibility that this might not be allowed." She stared at that entry for a moment. Then she added, "I am not sure whether this is confidence or ignorance. I am not sure there is a difference." She flagged the log for the Admiral's attention and went back to watching the sensors. The Persistence moved through the expanse. The stars around it were old and still and very far apart. The ship passed through their light without slowing, steady and deliberate and entirely unaware of the silence it was cutting through. 43 days. That was how long it had until it reached the edge of the region where other people were waiting. 43 days, and then everything was going to change. Nobody on the ship knew this yet. They were playing cards and sleeping and working and arguing about the best way to route a coolant line, and in 43 days they were going to walk into the most significant moment in human history. They were, in the quiet and honest opinion of several alien observers who had been watching them for days, completely ready. Not because they had prepared for it, but because they were the kind of people who simply got on with things. In the Keth Research Archives, a young analyst named Veth Kaur was pulling every record he could find on Sol 3. Most of what he found was old. Survey notes. Spectral analysis of the atmosphere. Thermal imaging from a probe flyby that had happened 2 centuries ago and apparently never been followed up. He read through all of it carefully, the way good analysts read everything. Not looking for something specific, but letting his mind settle on whatever seemed important. What seemed important was the atmosphere. The probe from 2 centuries ago had detected a composition that was slightly unusual. High oxygen, which was common in biologically active worlds, but also high levels of certain carbon compounds in the upper layers, levels that were higher than you would expect from natural processes alone. The analyst who had written the original report had noted this and moved on without comment, the way analysts did when they were looking at 100 different systems, and one of them had slightly odd atmospheric readings. Veth Kaur did not move on. He pulled comparative data on atmospheric compositions for inhabited worlds. He pulled records on what happened to atmospheres when a civilization began burning fossil fuels, which was a common early-stage development pattern. He looked at the numbers from Sol 3, and he looked at the comparative data, and he sat back in his chair. The levels in the Sol 3 atmosphere were consistent with what you would expect if a civilization had been burning fossil fuels at very high rates for about 2 centuries, and had then, relatively recently, stopped, or at least slowed down significantly. The current readings, which came from the radio signal analysis, showed an atmosphere that was trending back toward natural balance, slowly, but trending. So the people on that ship had looked at what they were doing to their own air, and had changed course. He noted this in his report and flagged it for the council. He did not know why it felt important. It just did. Something about the combination of building a faster-than-light ship and fixing your own atmosphere at the same time struck him as the kind of thing worth paying attention to. He was not wrong. Across the expanse, the Persistence continued on its heading. steady and quiet, its drive humming in a frequency that no human ear could detect, but that 3 sets of alien sensors were tracking with great care. Inside the ship, Commander Okafor was reviewing the survey data they had collected on the region ahead. The data was thin because their instruments were, by galactic standards, not very powerful. But what they had suggested the area was inhabited. There were signals, regular structured signals of the kind that meant engineering rather than natural phenomenon. She had known this for months. The mission briefing had said as much, in careful language that tried to account for the possibility that the signals were something other than what they looked like, because it was important to be scientific about these things and not assume. But Okafor had read the signals, and she had read the briefing, and she had made her own quiet assessment, which was that there were people out there, and she was going to meet them. She was not afraid of this. She had thought about whether she should be. In the careful late-night way she thought about hard questions, lying in her bunk in the dark with the sound of the ship around her. She had examined the fear from the outside, turned it over, considered it. The conclusion she kept arriving at was the same one. You could be afraid of meeting something new, or you could be curious about it. Both feelings were available. She had chosen curious. She set down her data tablet and looked at the course projection on the main screen. 43 days. The line on the screen went in a straight, clean path from where they were to where the signals came from, because that was the most direct route, and she saw no reason to take any other. Somewhere in the region ahead, people were watching her ship and asking questions about it. She would have liked that, if she had known. She liked questions. The Part 2. The Herald-class diplomatic vessel the Keth Consortium sent was called the Eternal Patience, and it was, by any fair measure, one of the most impressive ships in the Consortium's fleet. It was 3 times the length of most vessels in active service. Its outer hull was made of a material that changed color depending on the angle of the light, which the Keth considered aesthetically meaningful and symbolically appropriate for a ship representing their civilization to a new contact. It carried a crew of 400, which included 2 full teams of xenolinguists, a cultural assessment division, a medical support unit, capable of handling biology it had never encountered before, and a diplomatic corps that had spent the last 4 days reviewing every first contact protocol document the consortium had ever produced. The Eternal Patience also carried gifts. This was important. The Keth had learned, across 2 centuries of first contact with other civilizations, that gifts mattered. Not because the receiving civilization necessarily valued the objects themselves, but because the choice of gift said something about how seriously the giver was taking the encounter. The gifts loaded onto the Eternal Patience included a copy of the Keth's historical archives in several formats, samples of art from 7 different member species of the consortium, a set of scientific instruments that were about 2 generations ahead of anything the signal analysis suggested the Sol people would have, and a large quantity of a food substance that xenobiologists had assessed as chemically compatible with carbon-based life. Head diplomat Saras Chen, who was leading the contact mission, had reviewed all of this and approved it. She had been doing this work for 30 years, and she was good at it. She knew how to read a situation, how to read a species, how to find the tone that said we respect you, without saying we know more than you, which was a difficult balance to strike, and one that most diplomats got wrong at least once before they learned it. She was not nervous about this mission. She was, however, paying very close attention to everything she knew about the ship they were approaching, because it was unusual in ways she could not quite put into a category. The Persistence was running its broadcasts as it traveled. This was another unusual thing. Most ships in transit kept their communications focused, directional, pointed at a specific receiver. The Persistence was broadcasting on a wide cone, which meant it was essentially announcing its presence to the entire region. This could have been a diplomatic signal, a way of saying we are here and we are not hiding. It could also have been because the people on the ship did not know that was what they were doing. Saras Chen had read the assessment from the technical team, and the honest conclusion was that they could not tell which it was. What they had been able to do was begin decoding the signals from the broadcast. The Persistence was transmitting internal communications, not intentionally, as far as the analysts could determine. The ship's communication system was leaking its internal traffic outward, which again could have been a message, or could have been a design limitation. The linguists had been working on the language for 3 days. It was a complex language, tonal in some registers and structural in others, with a large vocabulary and what appeared to be significant regional variation. 3 days was not enough to achieve fluency, but it was enough to achieve fragments. From the fragments, Saras Chen had learned the following. The ship's commander was a woman. Her name was something that sounded like Okafor. She was direct in her speech, and her crew responded to her with a mix of respect and what appeared to be genuine personal warmth, which was interesting. The ship's medic had apparently won multiple card games against a crew member named Ariaga, who found this very unfair. The chief engineer had a strong opinion about coolant systems. Someone was writing a letter home to a family member they clearly missed very much. These were small things, but small things told you a great deal if you knew how to listen. Saras Chen listened and decided that the people on the Persistence were, whatever else they might be, genuinely human, in the sense she had come to understand the word. They were individual. They were specific. They had preferences and loyalties and irritations. They were not a symbol or a concept. They were people. She prepared her opening statement accordingly. The Persistence received the hailing signal when it was still 11 days out from the Keth relay station. It came in on 47 different frequencies simultaneously, which Commander Okafor noted was either very thorough or very anxious. The signal was structured, formal, layered in ways that suggested it had been designed to be understood even by someone who had never heard the language before. There were mathematical sequences embedded in it. There were audio patterns that corresponded to visual imagery in ways that, if you knew what to look for, allowed you to decode basic concepts without prior knowledge. Okafor called her team together. They had 4 linguists on board, not because the mission planners had expected to need them this soon, but because good science missions took linguists on principle. The team spent 2 hours with the signal. Then Dr. Priya Mehta, who was the senior linguist, came to the bridge with her tablet. She said she thought she could build a working response. Okafor asked how long it would take. Mehta said, "Give me 6 hours." Okafor gave her 5, because they had been receiving the hail for 11 hours already, and she thought 6 more was probably longer than necessary. 4 hours and 20 minutes later, Mehta came back with a draft response. Okafor read it over. It was careful and formal and appropriately humble, without being servile, which was the right balance. It acknowledged the hail, identified the ship and its origin, indicated peaceful intent, and asked for a meeting. Okafor read it a second time. Then she said, "This is good, but it is going to take them several hours to receive it at this distance, and then several hours to respond, and I would like to actually meet these people before we are all much older. What if I just talk to them directly?" Mehta said, "The signal delay means live conversation is not really possible yet." Okafor said, "I know, but in 6 days it will be. What if we keep responding as we travel, and by the time we are close enough for a real conversation, we have already established some kind of rapport?" Mehta thought about this, and said that was actually a reasonable approach. So that was what they did. Okafor recorded responses herself, in her own voice, in the Keth language, that Mehta coached her through, with patient and sometimes amused corrections. The responses went out on a directional beam aimed at whatever ship or station was sending the hail. They were imperfect. Okafor's pronunciation was not good, and her sentence structure occasionally wandered away from Keth grammar and into patterns that were more comfortable in her own language. But they were genuine, which was, in Okafor's experience, usually more important than perfect. 6 days later, when the Persistence had closed the distance enough for a signal exchange with only a few seconds of lag, there were people on the Eternal Patience who had been listening to Commander Okafor speak their language for almost a week. They had a lot of feelings about this. Saras Chen heard the first direct voice exchange between the 2 ships from the bridge of the Eternal Patience. The Persistence's commander spoke first, because she had been told the range was now suitable for direct communication, and she had apparently decided not to wait for the other side to initiate. Her voice came through the ship's speakers, slightly distorted by distance but clear enough. She said, in Keth, with a pronunciation that made the translation staff wince, and then quickly stop wincing, because it was still very impressive. "Hello. Are you the ones who have been calling us?" The bridge of the Eternal Patience was quiet for a moment. Then Saras Chen leaned toward her own transmitter and said, slowly and clearly, "Yes. We are the Keth Consortium. We received your drive signature in our monitoring arrays 11 days ago. We are very glad you have answered our hail." There was a pause. Then the Persistence commander said, "I'm glad too. My name is Yael Okafor. I am the commander of the exploration vessel Persistence. We are from the third planet of the Sol system. We have been traveling for 11 months. She paused again and then added, We noticed some signals coming from your direction about 2 years ago, and we thought we should come and see what was making them. Saras Chen wrote a note on her tablet. It said, They came because they were curious. She underlined this 3 times. The exchange continued for about an hour, working through basic identification and purpose and intent, in the careful way that early contact required. Okafor answered every question directly. She did not hedge, and she did not perform. When she did not know something, she said she did not know. When she was asked about the Persistence's drive technology, she gave a brief technical description, and added that she could share more detailed specifications if that would be useful. And Saras Chen had to take a moment before responding, because the answer to that question was so obviously yes, that she needed to compose herself before she said it. At the end of the hour, Saras Chen said they would like to invite the Persistence's commander aboard the Eternal Patience for a formal meeting. Okafor said, Actually, could you come to us instead? Yeah. We have been traveling for 11 months, and I think my crew would appreciate some company. There was another pause on the Eternal Patience's bridge. This was not the protocol. The protocol was very clear about the sequence of events, and the significance of the physical location of the first formal meeting, which was supposed to take place in neutral space, on a mutually agreed platform. The Persistence was not neutral space. It was a Sol vessel. Saras Chen looked at the note she had written on her tablet. She thought about what it said. Then she said, We would be happy to come to you. The shuttle from the Eternal Patience docked with the Persistence with no difficulty, which was good because the docking systems were not designed for each other, and the engineers on both sides had spent the previous 48 hours working out an improvised connection that would hold atmosphere. Saras Chen stepped through the connecting tube and into the Persistence with 4 members of her diplomatic team and 3 translators. She was prepared, in the way she always prepared, for the moment of first physical contact with a new species. She had done this 11 times before. It was always the same in certain ways, and always different in others. Commander Okafor was waiting for her on the other side. She was a tall woman with close-cut dark hair, and the kind of stillness that comes from spending a lot of time in small spaces with people you need to trust completely. She was wearing a uniform that was clearly practical, rather than ceremonial, and she was standing with her hands at her sides, which Saras Chen read as open and direct. She had 2 crew members behind her, one of whom turned out to be the chief engineer, whose name was Marcus Webb, and one of whom was the senior linguist, Dr. Mehta. Okafor looked at Saras Chen for a moment, and then said, In careful Keth, it is very good to meet you. Saras Chen said the same in return, and meant it. The tour of the Persistence took about 40 minutes. Saras Chen had prepared her team for the possibility that the ship would be different from what they knew, and different it was. But the nature of the difference was not what any of them had expected. They had expected it to be primitive, which it was, in technical terms. What they had not expected was for it to be so clearly, so completely used. Every surface showed the marks of people living and working in it. The repair patches on the wall panels were done carefully, but they were visible. The equipment was secured with a variety of methods, some designed for the purpose and some improvised. In the galley, there was a small board where crew members had written messages to each other in 2 languages. One of Saras Chen's team members, a young man who handled cultural assessment, kept making notes on his own tablet as they walked. She caught a glimpse of one of them. It said, This ship is loved. She thought that was exactly right. In the engineering section, Webb showed them the drive system. He was visibly proud of it, in a way that he was clearly trying to moderate, because he was not sure if pride was appropriate here. He explained how the bubble effect worked in terms that Saras Chen could follow about 60% of, and the rest of which she had to take on trust. When he was done explaining, he looked at her the way engineers look when they have explained something they are not sure the listener understood. She said, You built this in 300 years. He said, Well, more like 12. We had the theory for a while, but the practical engineering took some time. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, In 12 years. He smiled, a little uncertain, and said, It's not perfect. No, Saras Chen thought. It crossed 4.3 light-years in 11 months, and it is not perfect. She looked at the drive system, which was bolted to the floor with brackets she was fairly sure were not original to the design. And she thought about all the ships in the Keth Consortium's fleet, which were beautiful and efficient, and the product of 9,000 years of accumulated knowledge. And she thought about what you could do if you did not have 9,000 years, and you decided to figure it out anyway. That evening, over a meal that involved food from both ships, in an arrangement that the medical teams on both sides had carefully assessed for safety, and then cautiously approved, Saras Chen and Okafor talked for 3 hours. They talked about the mission. They talked about what humanity knew of the galaxy, and what the Keth knew, and the ways these overlapped, and the ways they did not. They talked about the drive system, and Okafor explained certain things that Saras Chen did not tell her she could easily verify against Keth physics records, because Okafor arrived at correct conclusions through paths that were different from the Keth paths, and she wanted to understand the path as much as the conclusion. At some point in the 3rd hour, Saras Chen asked Okafor what she hoped to find out here. Okafor thought about this for a moment. She was not a person who answered questions she had not considered, but she also did not take so long that you thought she was hiding something. She just thought. Then she said, "Everything." Saras Chen said, "Can you be more specific?" Okafor said, "Not really. We don't know what we're going to find, so we don't know exactly what we're looking for. We're looking for whatever is out here. All of it." Saras Chen thought about this. In 30 years of diplomatic work, she had met many representatives of many civilizations. They had different goals and different fears, and different ways of presenting themselves. But when you asked them what they wanted, they almost always had an answer that involved something specific: resources, territory, protection, alliance, knowledge of a particular kind. She had never before had someone tell her they wanted everything. Not because everything was too much, but because they seemed to genuinely think that everything was a reasonable thing to want, and that wanting it was the same as being ready to go looking for it. She went back to the Eternal Patience that night and wrote her report to the council. The report was long and detailed and covered all the relevant diplomatic and scientific observations. At the very end, she added a personal note. It was not standard practice to add personal notes to official reports. She added one anyway. She wrote, "I think we have been waiting for them without knowing it. I think this is the beginning of something. I am not afraid of that. I want to be clear that I am not afraid. I am just trying to tell you that things are going to be different now, and I believe they are going to be different in ways we cannot fully plan for." She submitted the report. Then she stood at her own observation port for a while, looking at the stars, thinking about a woman on a ship that was held together with improvised brackets, and had been carried across the empty dark to here, by nothing more or less than the determination of 22 people who wanted to see what was out there. The stars looked the same as always. They felt different now. In the morning, Saras Chen received a response from the council. It was shorter than she expected. It said, "We understand. Continue as you see fit." She read this several times. In her 30 years of diplomatic work, the council had never once told her to continue as she saw fit. They always had guidance. They always had protocols and instructions and carefully worded objectives. Continue as you see fit was not the language of an institution that knew what to do next. She found this both alarming and oddly freeing. She requested a second meeting with Okafor. Okafor received the request during her morning briefing. She agreed immediately and added it to her schedule between a systems check and a video message session she had set aside for crew members who wanted to record letters home. She thought, as she prepared for the second meeting, about how it felt to be on the other side of this. She had wondered, in the months before they reached this region of space, what first contact would be like. She had imagined many versions of it. Some were awe-inspiring, some were frightening. In some of the versions she had imagined, the beings they met were so different that communication was nearly impossible. The reality was that Saras Chen was, in most of the ways that mattered, a person. She had opinions and experiences, and a way of thinking that was different from Okafor's, but that was legible, followable, comprehensible. She got frustrated when things did not go according to plan, which was something Okafor understood well. She was careful with her words in a way that suggested she had learned the cost of imprecision. She listened with her whole attention, which was rarer than it should have been in anyone, human or otherwise. Okafor had been many things in her life. She had been a student and a junior officer, and a mission specialist, and eventually a commander. She had learned to read people quickly, because command required it. What she read in Saras Chen was someone who was genuinely trying to understand something, not just fulfill a function. She respected that. The second meeting was longer than the first. They talked about the Keth Consortium, its structure and its member species, and how it made decisions. They talked about Earth and its governments, and how humanity organized itself, which Okafor acknowledged was complicated, and Saras Chen said she had gathered as much from the radio broadcasts they had decoded. They talked about other civilizations in the galaxy, and here Saras Chen was careful and measured, but honest, giving Okafor a picture of the broader landscape that was accurate, without being overwhelming. Okafor listened to all of this with the same quality of attention that Saras Chen had noticed in her from the beginning. She did not interrupt. She asked questions at the right moments, the kind of questions that showed she had understood what was said, and was following the thread forward to the next logical point. When Saras Chen finished describing the general structure of galactic civilization as the Keth understood it, there was a brief silence. Then Okafor said, "So there are a lot of people out here." Saras Chen said, "Yes." Okafor said, "And most of them have been in space for much longer than we have." Saras Chen said, "That is correct." Okafor nodded. She looked at the table between them for a moment, then back up. She said, "Okay, that's good to know." Saras Chen waited for more. There was no more. Okafor had taken in the information, assessed it, and filed it away as useful context. She did not seem intimidated by it. She did not seem to feel that it changed her position, or her purpose in any fundamental way. She had come out here to find out what was out here, and she had found out. And now that was part of what she knew. Saras Chen thought about the civilizations she had worked with over 30 years. She thought about how most of them had reacted when they first understood the scale of galactic civilization, the sheer age and complexity of it. Most of them had taken some time to process. Most of them had needed reassurance of some kind, needed to know where they fit, needed to understand how to position themselves relative to everything else. Okafor had heard the same information and said okay, not dismissively, not naively, with the steady acceptance of someone who had expected the universe to be large and interesting, and was not surprised to find out that it was. Saras Chen made another note on her tablet. She wrote, "I think they are going to be fine." Some Part 3. The Grand Assembly of the Keth Consortium met once every 10 years, under normal circumstances. Under extraordinary circumstances, which this clearly was, it could be called early. Saras Chen had sent her recommendation to the council 6 days after the initial meeting with the persistence. The recommendation was simple. Humanity should be formally received by the consortium, and the reception should happen now, while the persistence was still in the region, while the contact was fresh, and the opportunity was present. Waiting another 6 months for a full planning cycle would send the wrong message. The council agreed. They called the assembly. It was the most significant gathering in at least 300 years. 140 species were represented, which meant the main chamber of the assembly hall on Keth Station was filled with beings of almost every physical description the galaxy had to offer. Some of them stood, some of them floated, some of them communicated through means other than sound. The smell in the chamber was complex in ways that required the environmental systems to work very hard. The noise, even when the assembly was technically in order, was constant. Commander Okafor arrived with 4 crew members. She had been offered a larger escort. The Keth protocol team had suggested that a formal delegation of 12 would be appropriate for an event of this scale. Okafor had listened politely to this suggestion, and then said she would bring 4, because 12 people would leave the ship understaffed, and she did not think the assembly would mind. The assembly did not mind. The assembly was, in fact, watching Commander Okafor with the kind of intense collective attention that she appeared not to notice, or at least not to be bothered by. She walked through the chamber with her 4 crew members at the measured pace of someone who is looking at everything and storing it all for later. She looked at the delegates. She looked at the architecture. She looked at the environmental systems along the ceiling. She had brought a recording device, a small one that she wore on a clip near her shoulder, and it was clearly running. She was, Saras Chen observed from her seat in the diplomatic section, documenting. Researcher Veth Kaur, who had been assigned to observe the human delegation, wrote in his notes, "She came here to a ceremony that will be told about for centuries, and she brought a notebook." He wrote this with admiration. The formal reception took 4 hours. It proceeded through the standard protocols, the reading of the Codex of Welcome, which was a document that had been updated 400 times over the centuries, and which acknowledged each new species joining the broader community of spacefaring peoples. The presentation of gifts, the address by the first voice of the consortium, which was a long and carefully composed speech about the joy of new contact and the richness of the galactic community. And finally, the response from the new civilization's representative. Okafor's response was 3 minutes and 40 seconds long. The protocol team had suggested, gently, that a response of 10 to 15 minutes would be appropriate. Okafor had listened and then written a response that was 3 minutes and 40 seconds long, because that was how long she needed, and she did not see the point of making it longer. She thanked the consortium. She said that humanity was glad to find out it had neighbors. She said that she hoped they would be good ones. She said that the persistence had come a long way to be here, and she was pleased to say the trip had been worth it. Then she sat down. The chamber was quiet for a moment that lasted slightly longer than expected. Then the response came, which was the various forms of acknowledgement that 140 species produced when they were registering something, and the sound of it filled the room. Saras Chen, who had attended many of these assemblies, had never heard that particular quality of response before. It was not applause exactly, and it was not silence. It was the sound of a very large group of people processing something they had not quite expected. After the formal ceremony, there was a reception. Receptions at grand assemblies were themselves significant events, because they were where the actual exchanges happened, the conversations that did not get recorded in the official proceedings, but that shaped what the proceedings meant. Okafor moved through the reception with the same unhurried attention she had brought to everything else. She accepted introductions from delegates who wanted to speak with her. She listened carefully to what they said. She asked questions. She asked a lot of questions. The questions were what people noticed. They were not the questions of someone who was overwhelmed or uncertain. They were not the questions of someone performing curiosity for an audience. They were the questions of someone who genuinely wanted to know things and had identified the people in the room most likely to be able to tell them. She spent 40 minutes with a Shul scientist who studied stellar formation. She spent 30 minutes with a Vorath historian who had written about interstellar conflict resolution. She spent an hour with a collective of beings called the Mern, who were 3 species that had merged their social structures so thoroughly over several thousand years that they now presented jointly for all formal purposes, and who were, it emerged, very interested in the same dark energy anomalies that the Persistence's instruments had flagged on the way in. The Mern collective asked detailed questions about the Persistence's sensor readings. Okafor answered them from memory, which was impressive, and then said she could share the full data set if they were interested. The Mern said they were very interested. Okafor said, "Good. Can you help me understand what's causing the pattern, because our current models don't quite explain it?" The Mern were quiet for a moment. Then one of them said, "We have been studying that pattern for about 800 years. We are not sure we understand it either." Okafor said, "Okay, so we can be confused about it together. That sounds like a good place to start." The Shul elder, known as Thought in Long Arcs, had attended the assembly in person, which was itself unusual. The Shul rarely attended in person. They were old enough that most of their interactions with other civilizations were conducted through representatives and intermediaries. The fact that she had come herself meant something. She watched Okafor throughout the reception. She watched her move from conversation to conversation. She watched her ask questions and listen to answers. She watched her take notes on a small device she kept in her pocket. At the end of the reception, Thought in Long Arcs made her way to where Okafor was standing. She introduced herself. Okafor's eyes went to the insignia the Elder wore, which any reasonably prepared diplomat would have recognized as marking the highest level of Shul seniority, and her expression did not change in the way expressions sometimes changed when people understood they were talking to someone very important. She just looked interested. Thought in Long Arcs said, "I have a question for you." Okafor said, "I would like that. I've been asking everyone else questions. It seems fair." The Elder said, "You presented your species today to 140 civilizations, some of whom have been in space for longer than your planet has had complex life. How do you feel about that?" Okafor thought about this. The Elder appreciated the fact that she thought about it rather than producing an immediate answer. Then Okafor said, "Honestly, a little like I showed up to a party where everyone else has known each other for 1,000 years. Slightly behind on the context. But that's fine. You catch up." The Elder was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is a very healthy way to feel about it. Okafor said. Were you expecting something different? The elder said, most civilizations, when they understand the scale of what surrounds them, need time to adjust. Some of them need a great deal of time. You arrived here, saw all of this, and your first response was that you would catch up. Okafor looked around the room, at the 140 species, at the ancient station, at the deep and complex civilization that had been building itself while humanity was still learning to farm. She said, we have been behind before. We always catch up. She said this simply, not as a boast, as a statement of observed fact. Thought in long arcs, thought about all the civilizations she had known in her long life. She thought about how many of them had said things like this, and what had happened afterward. Most of them had been wrong. Most of them had not in fact caught up, or had done so slowly and partially and with great difficulty. The universe was old and the knowledge in it was vast, and catching up was not something most civilizations managed to do at the speed they imagined. She looked at Okafor. She thought about the ship that had traveled 4.3 light-years in 11 months, using a drive developed in 12 years by a civilization that had only had spaceflight for 300. She thought, perhaps this one means it. 3 days after the assembly, the Keth Science Council received a document from the Persistence. It was a technical paper, 47 pages. It had been prepared, apparently, over the course of the 11-month journey, by 3 members of the Persistence crew. It was about dark energy distribution in the Verath expanse, and it contained, in its 3rd section, a mathematical analysis of a theoretical model the Keth had been refining for about 200 years. The analysis pointed out an error, not a large error, not the kind of error that invalidated 200 years of work, but a genuine inconsistency in the model's handling of mass distribution at large scales that had produced predictions that did not quite match observed data, and which the authors of the paper had identified and corrected with an approach that the Keth had not previously considered. The head of the Keth Science Council, a man named Senior Adept Vera Thos, read the paper carefully. Then he read it again. Then he sent it to the 5 best mathematicians in the council, with a message that said, please check this. It took them 6 days. 6 days during which Vera Thos did not sleep well, and found himself going back to the paper repeatedly, reading the 3rd section again, looking for the flaw that should have been there. There was no flaw. The math was correct. The Persistence crew's correction was valid. On the 7th day, one of the mathematicians sent him a message. It said, they're right. The model has been off for 200 years. I don't know how they found this. And Vera Thos wrote back, I think they found it because they built their own model from scratch and looked at ours fresh. He thought about this for a while after he sent the message. He thought about what it meant to look at something fresh. He thought about how, after you had been working on a problem for 2 centuries, you stopped being able to see the parts of it that you had decided were settled. You stopped questioning your own foundations. You accepted certain things as known and built on top of them. And then someone came along who had not been working on the problem for 2 centuries and looked at your foundations and said, this part is slightly wrong. He called a full council meeting and shared the paper. The meeting was long, and the discussion was heated in places, the way discussions get when smart people are confronting something they do not want to be true, but cannot argue away. By the end of the meeting, the council had formally acknowledged the correction and begun planning how to update the model. Vera Thos sent a message to Saris Chen asking her to pass along the council's thanks to Commander Okafor. Saris Chen passed along the message. Okafor sent back a brief reply. She said, glad it was useful. If you want, we can share the rest of our sensor data from the expanse. We picked up a few other things that might be interesting. Saris Chen read this and laughed for the first time in several days. The Vorath response to all of this was complicated. Admiral Keth Saros had watched the assembly through his monitoring feeds. He had watched the reception. He had watched Okafor move through the room full of the most significant people in the known galaxy, and ask them all questions and take notes. He had watched the interaction with the Shul Elder, which his linguists had managed to partially translate. He had then watched his monitoring ship's record of the Persistence entering the Drek Nebula. The Drek Nebula was a region of the expanse that nobody went into voluntarily. It had high levels of charged particle radiation, which played havoc with navigation systems, and it had some kind of gravitational irregularity in its center that the Keth and Vorath had both studied from a distance, and neither had been willing to enter to investigate directly. The Persistence had gone in without apparent hesitation, It had come back 11 days later. It had transmitted a detailed survey package to the Keth station. The Admiral had requested a copy of the survey package. The Keth had shared it. The Vorath Science Division had spent a week going through it. The survey was extraordinary. The gravitational irregularity in the center of the Drek was, it turned out, a remnant structure from a star that had collapsed in an unusual way about 2 million years ago, leaving behind a distortion that the Persistence's instruments had mapped in detail. The charged particle radiation was not random, as both the Keth and Vorath had assumed, but followed a pattern that the survey package's authors had worked out and expressed in a set of equations that described the pattern precisely. Admiral Keth Saros looked at the survey package for a long time. Then he summoned his senior staff and told them what he thought. He said, "The humans went into a place we have been avoiding for 400 years and they came back with a complete survey. They did this without being asked. They did this on their own initiative." He paused. He said, "I want you to understand what this tells us about them. It does not tell us they are reckless. It tells us they make different calculations about risk than we do." His intelligence officer said, "What kind of calculations?" The Admiral said, "The kind where going somewhere dangerous to find out what is there is worth the risk. The kind where the value of the information is higher than the cost of the danger." He paused again. He said, "I have been trying for 2 weeks to decide if the humans are a threat to the hegemony. I have not been able to answer this question, because I keep trying to map them onto something familiar. They are not familiar." He looked at his staff. He said, "I do not think they are a threat, but I think they are going to change a great deal, and I think we should decide what we want our relationship with them to be before they change it for us." His staff was quiet. Then his intelligence officer said, "Should we approach them?" The Admiral said, "Send an invitation, a direct one, not through the Keth, and make it clear we are interested in the survey data. That is a common language anyone can speak." The invitation was sent the following morning. Okafor responded in 4 hours. She said yes. The meeting between Okafor and the Vorath took place aboard a Vorath vessel called the Steadfast Calculation, which was a warship that had been chosen for the meeting not as a display of military power, but because it was the nearest Vorath ship, and the Admiral had decided that waiting for a more appropriate vessel was less important than acting quickly. Okafor came with 2 crew members. This was noted. She consistently brought fewer people to things than the protocol suggested, which could have been read as minimizing the significance of the events. But watching her, the Vorath officers who met her at the docking bay concluded that this was not what it meant. She brought fewer people because she was confident in herself and did not need reinforcement. The size of a delegation was often about the insecurity of the leader. Okafor did not seem insecure. Admiral Keth Saros met with her in the ship's main briefing room. He was a large man by the standards of his species, formal in his bearing in the way that high-ranking Vorath were always formal, which meant he communicated through posture and precision as much as through words. He had prepared for this meeting carefully. He had prepared the wrong things. He had prepared a presentation on the Vorath hegemony, its structure, and its values, and its place in the galactic order. He had prepared a summary of the regions of space the Vorath administered. He had prepared a formal statement of interest in building relations with humanity. He got through the presentation in about 20 minutes. Okafor listened attentively throughout. When he finished, she thanked him. Then she put her hands on the table and said, "I have looked at the region your hegemony administers. There is a band of space on the outer edge that shows some unusual readings on our long-range sensors. We have been trying to figure out what is causing the pattern." She looked at him directly. She said, "Do you know what it is?" The Admiral had not expected this question. He thought for a moment. Then he said, "That region is called the boundary zone. The readings come from a collection of very old structures. Nobody knows who built them. We have been studying them for about 600 years. Okafor said, 600 years and you still don't know. He said, "They are very complex structures." She said, "We would like to take a look." The Admiral looked at her for a moment. The boundary zone was not technically restricted, but it was the kind of place that civilizations did not simply announce they wanted to visit. There were conversations first. There were assessments and protocols and carefully managed access arrangements. It was the kind of thing that took months to arrange, he said. "That can be arranged." "It would take some time," she said. "How much time?" He said. 3 to 4 months, perhaps. She said, "We have a scheduled return window in 2 months that we need to hit for fuel management reasons. Can it be done in 6 weeks?" He thought about this. 6 weeks was not enough time for the normal process. But the normal process, he was beginning to understand, had not been designed with humans in mind. He said, "I will see what I can do." She said thank you with complete sincerity, and then asked him if he wanted to see the Drek Nebula survey data over lunch. He said yes. He found that he was looking forward to it. Back on the Persistence, Dr. Mehta had been compiling a report on the languages she had encountered since their arrival. She had now had some exposure to 9 different languages spoken by species in the consortium. Of these 9, she had basic functional ability in 4, which was less than she wanted, but more than anyone back home would have expected from 6 weeks of contact. She had been working in her sleep hours, running the language data through analysis programs and cross-referencing patterns, looking for the underlying structures that made communication possible between beings with very different vocal equipment and very different ways of organizing information. The thing she had found, which she kept returning to, was that all of the languages she had encountered followed patterns that were recognizable even when the surface features were completely foreign. There were structures for asking questions, and structures for making statements. There were ways of marking what was known versus what was uncertain. There were ways of indicating that something was important or urgent. The surface of the languages was alien. The underlying logic of them was, in some fundamental way, the same. She was writing a paper about this. She wrote it in the hours between shifts, in her bunk with a small light, the same way she had written her graduate thesis years ago in the small room, in a city that felt very far away now. She thought about what it meant, that all these different minds that had never encountered each other had built languages on similar foundations. She thought about what it suggested about the nature of thought and meaning and the way minds organized the world. She thought it suggested something hopeful, though she was careful in her paper to use more precise language than hopeful. She sent a draft to Okafor, who read it and said it was the most interesting thing she had read since they left home. Meta sent a copy to the Keth Xenolinguist team as well, with a note saying she would be glad to discuss it further if they were interested. They were very interested. What followed was 3 weeks of intensive exchange between Meta and the Keth team that ended with a joint paper and 2 members of the Keth team asking, somewhat tentatively, if they might be able to continue the collaboration after the Persistence returned home. Meta said yes immediately. Okafor, when she was told about this, said, "Good. Put them on the contact list." The contact list was something Okafor had started on the 2nd day after the assembly. It was a simple document, nothing complicated, just names and species and areas of interest, and the best way to reach each person. It had 47 entries now. She added new ones whenever she met someone worth staying in contact with, which turned out to be most of the people she met. The crew had started calling it the network. Okafor just called it the people she had met out here. 47 people, from 14 different species, in 6 weeks. The return trip home was 2 months away. She kept adding names. Part 4. The file on Sol 3 had a secondary layer. This was not unusual. Keth survey records often had secondary data layers, automatically compiled from available sources at the time of the survey, and locked behind a processing flag that marked them as low-priority background material. Most secondary layers were never opened. They contained atmospheric data, electromagnetic noise profiles, biological density estimates, that kind of thing, useful only in specific circumstances. The original survey team had flagged the Sol 3 secondary layer as non-priority, and it had sat untouched for 200 years. Researcher Veth Kaur found it on a Tuesday. He had been going through the Sol 3 file systematically, the way he had been going through it since the Persistence arrived, looking for context he might have missed. He was thorough by nature. He was the kind of researcher who found things because he looked everywhere and not just in the obvious places. When he opened the secondary layer and saw what it contained, he sat very still for a long time. Then he closed it. Then he opened it again, because closing it had not made it not real. The secondary layer contained the Keth survey drone's passive recording of Sol 3's electromagnetic output over the 3-week period the drone had spent in the system 200 years ago. 3 weeks was a short window, but 3 weeks of recorded electromagnetic output from a civilization was, if you had the right analysis tools, enough to learn a great deal about it. The Keth did have the right analysis tools. The analysis had been run automatically at the time of the survey. The results had been filed in the secondary layer and marked low priority, because the survey had not been focused on civilizational assessment, and the team had moved on to the next system. Vethkor read through the analysis. He read about the wars. There had been at least 3 ongoing when the survey drone was in the system, 200 years ago. He read about the resource conflicts. He read about what appeared to be a major environmental crisis, the same atmospheric issue he had identified earlier but seen now in more detail, more clearly a crisis and less clearly a gradual drift. He read about the disease outbreaks the drone had detected through hospital broadcast frequencies. He read about what appeared to be a significant economic collapse affecting a large portion of the planet's surface. 200 years ago, from the outside, Sol 3 had looked like a civilization in the process of coming apart. And then, reading further, he found the data that corresponded to the same period from the radio signal analysis, the entertainment broadcasts, which he had looked at earlier and set aside. He looked at them now with different eyes. He looked at them in the context of what else was happening. People had made art during the wars. They had made music during the environmental crisis. They had broadcast stories during the economic collapse. Not just escape, although some of it was, but also documentation, also witness, also the particular human act of taking something terrible and turning it into a thing that could be shared and understood and carried forward. He sat with this for a long time. He requested a meeting with Adept Chithara Lin. She was the oldest member of the Science Council, and she had been the first to take the persistence seriously. She was 70 years old by Keth reckoning, and she had spent most of those years studying civilizations in the same careful way that Vethkor was just beginning to learn. He showed her the secondary layer. She read through it without speaking. When she finished, she said, "How long ago was this?" He said, 200 years ago, give or take. She was quiet. He said, "The civilization that sent that ship went through this 200 years ago, and now they are here." She said, "Yes." He said, "How?" She looked at him. She said, "That is the right question. I do not know the answer. I am not sure it can be answered from outside. I think it would have to come from them." He thought about this. He said, "Should we tell them what we found?" She said, "They already know. This is their history. We are not discovering it for them." He paused. She added more quietly, "But I think we should understand what we are looking at. Because I have been studying civilizations for 50 years and I have not seen this before." He asked her to explain. She said, "Most civilizations reach the stars because things went well enough for long enough. Stability allows development. Development allows expansion. This is the pattern. A civilization that is at war with itself, that is poisoning its own air, that is losing people to disease and economic failure, should not be developing interstellar drives. The resources are going the wrong way. The attention is going the wrong way." She paused. She said, "The people on that ship came from something that looked, 200 years ago, like it was not going to make it. And yet here they are. I want to understand that." Vethkor said, "Do you think they knew? When they were in the middle of all of that, do you think they knew they were going to make it?" Chithara Lin said, "I think some of them did and some of them didn't. I think the ones who believed they could kept going anyway. And I think the ones who didn't believe it kept going too, for different reasons." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "This is unusual. Most beings, when they believe they will fail, stop. These ones kept going, even when they were not sure." The Vorath general who met with Okafor about the boundary zone was named Saren Aid, and she was the third most senior officer in the hegemony's military. She had been chosen for the meeting because she was the kind of person who could have a difficult conversation without it becoming a confrontational one, which was a rare quality and a valuable one. The meeting started well. They went over the survey data from the Drek Nebula, which the Vorath science teams had been analyzing and were enthusiastic about. They discussed the boundary zone access arrangement that the Admiral had promised, which was on track for the 6-week window Okafor had requested. They talked about the kinds of scientific exchange that might be possible. Then General Serenade said, because she had decided to be direct about it, "I want to ask you something, and I want to be clear that I am asking with respect and genuine curiosity, not with any other intent." Okafor said, "Go ahead." The general said, "We have been looking at the history of your planet, not deeply, but enough to understand that 200 years ago your species was facing several serious crises simultaneously: conflict, environmental damage, disease, significant social and economic instability. Okafor's face did not change. She just waited. The general said, "And then you are here. 150 years after that point, give or take, here you are. I want to understand how you got from there to here. Not because I doubt you are here. You are clearly here. I want to understand the path." Okafor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't think there was a single path. I think there were a lot of paths that happened at the same time, and that collectively added up to something." The general said, "Can you describe some of them?" Okafor said, "We almost didn't make it. I want to be honest about that. There were periods where the realistic assessment was that we were not going to come out the other side in good shape. The environmental crisis was very bad for about 70 years. The resource conflicts in the mid-period were worse than most people who weren't there can picture. We lost a lot of people. We made a lot of mistakes that made things harder than they needed to be." The general said, "And yet," Okafor said, "and yet." She paused. She said, "I think the short version is that there were always people who decided the situation was recoverable. Not always the same people. Not always the majority. But enough people at the right moments who said this can be fixed, and then worked on fixing it. And then other people saw that it was possible to fix, and joined in." She paused again. "And a lot of the things we went through forced us to develop things we needed. The drive system we used to get here came directly out of energy research we were doing, because we had to find new energy sources. The international cooperation that made the mission possible came directly out of the agreements we built to handle the environmental crisis." She looked at the general. "We didn't get here despite everything that happened. We got here partly because of it." The general was very still. She said, "That is not the trajectory I expected you to describe." Okafor said, "What did you expect?" She said, "I expected you to say you solved the problems, and then developed. That is the normal order of things. First stability, then expansion." Okafor said, "We did both at the same time. It was not comfortable." She paused. "It made us very good at doing several things at once." The general wrote this down. Back at the Keth station, Thought in Long Arcs had requested access to the secondary survey layer from Veth Core. He shared it with her. She read through it slowly, in the way the Shul read everything, which was the way people read things when they have read a great many things, and understand that speed is not the same as comprehension. When she was done, she went to the long observation deck at the far end of the station and stood there for several hours. The other Shul elders knew not to interrupt her when she was doing this. She was thinking in the long way, which was the way the Shul thought about things that mattered. Short thoughts were for quick decisions. Long thoughts were for the things that changed how you understood everything else. What she was thinking about was memory. The Shul had been in space for so long that most of what they knew about their own early history came from records rather than from lived experience. Nobody alive remembered what it had been like to be a young civilization. Nobody remembered the period before the stars. The Shul's early history was something they studied the way you study an ancient artifact, with care and with distance, and with the understanding that you can know the shape of something without knowing what it felt like from the inside. She had encountered in her long life civilizations in their early stages before. She had seen species make first contact when they were young, excited, sometimes frightened. She had seen them grow. She had seen some of them make mistakes they did not recover from, and some of them make mistakes they did. And over a long enough span of time you could see the difference between the two kinds even when you were in the middle of it. She thought about what she had just read. She thought about a species that had been in crisis 200 years ago and had arrived here, in this region of space, in a ship that worked by a principle they had figured out on their own in 12 years. She thought about the Shul's own records of their early period. The records were incomplete, but they held fragments. She thought about those fragments now. Then she thought about something else. Something old. Something the Shul did not talk about with other civilizations because the other civilizations were not old enough to have context for it yet. There had been, a very long time ago, another species that had arrived in the galaxy the way the humans were arriving now. Young, fast-moving, curious, seemingly undisturbed by the scale of what surrounded them. There were only fragments about this species in the Shul's deep records. The fragments did not say much about what happened to them. What they said was that this species had been unlike anything the civilizations of that era had encountered, and that after their arrival things had been different, and that different had turned out to mean better in ways that the beings of that era had not expected. She did not know enough to know if the humans were the same kind of thing. She did not know enough to be sure. But she thought about the woman who had walked into a room full of 140 civilizations and said she hoped they would be good neighbors. And she thought about the ship held together with improvised brackets that had crossed interstellar space in 11 months. And she thought about the paper that had corrected 200 years of Keth math. And she thought about the fact that in 6 weeks, this crew had made contact with 14 different species and started a scientific collaboration and surveyed a region of space that nobody else had been willing to enter for 4 centuries. She thought, if they are the same kind of thing, we are very lucky. She thought, if they are not, we are still lucky. She stood at the observation deck until the light through the station's ports shifted, marking the end of the day cycle. Then she went to write a message to the eldest member of the Shul Council. The message said, I need to tell you about a ship I have been watching. It was a very long message. Tomas Arriaga had not been in any of the formal meetings. His job on the Persistence was environmental systems, which meant he kept the air clean and the water recycled, and the temperature in the habitable range. And none of that required him to sit in rooms with alien diplomats or answer questions about humanity's history. He was fine with this. He was good at his work, and he liked it. And he had never been particularly interested in being in the center of things. What he had been doing, in the time the ship spent near Keth Station, was talking to people. Not formally, not as a representative of anything. Just the way you talk to people when you are in a place full of them, and you have a curious nature and enough exposure to the Keth language now to manage basic conversation. He had talked to a Keth maintenance worker who was doing the same job he did on the station that he did on the ship. They had compared notes on atmosphere filtration systems. The worker's system was more sophisticated than the Persistence's system by several generations of technology. But the principles were the same, and they had spent an hour drawing diagrams for each other on a shared tablet and making the sounds of appreciation that people make when they recognize good engineering. He had talked to a young member of the Mern Collective, one of the 3 species merged group that had been excited about the Persistence's sensor data. The young Mern had been studying the Veroth expanse for the past 3 years, and had a lot of opinions about the dark energy readings that Arriaga had not been the one to collect, but that he had been present for. They talked for 2 hours. Arriaga came away with a significantly better understanding of galactic dark energy distribution than he had arrived with. He had talked to a crew member from a ship called the Keth Constant, a supply vessel that was docked at the station for routine servicing. The crew member was not a scientist or a diplomat or anything like that. She transported cargo. She had been transporting cargo for 20 years on the same route between 3 station points, and she knew that route better than anyone, and she had opinions about the gravitational irregularities along it that the official charts did not account for. She gave Arriaga the informal chart, the one that the experienced pilots used rather than the official version. He gave her a copy of the Drek Nebula survey data. They both came away from the exchange feeling that it had been worthwhile. He wrote all of these conversations down in a personal log that he kept on his tablet, not because he had been asked to, because he wanted to remember them. At the end of the 6 weeks, when Okafor called the crew together to begin preparing for the return home, he read back through his log. He counted the people he had talked to, not counting formal events, just conversations, the informal kind, the kind that happened in corridors and maintenance bays and over shared tables. 31 conversations, 14 different species. He thought about his grandmother telling him the universe was too large to be empty. He thought, she was right, and they are all very interesting. The day before the Persistence was scheduled to begin its return journey, Okafor received 2 things. The first was a formal message from the Keth Consortium, signed by the full council, offering humanity a seat at the Grand Assembly as a recognized spacefaring civilization. The message included a summary of the rights and responsibilities this would entail, and a note that the consortium understood if humanity needed time to consider the offer, and that there was no urgency. The second was a personal message from Adept Chithara Lin. Chithara Lin's message was shorter than the official one. It said, I have been thinking about your species for the past 6 weeks, and I wanted to say something before you leave that I think is important. What you did to get here was not normal. I have spent 50 years studying civilizations, and I want you to understand that what looks normal to you is not. Most species take the stars gradually, over long periods of stability and careful development. You did not have that. What you had was worse, and you came anyway, and you arrived here asking questions about dark energy, and making friends with cargo pilots and correcting our math. I think that is remarkable. I wanted to say that to someone who could actually hear it. Okafor read this message twice. Then she wrote back. She said, "Thank you. We don't always think about ourselves from the outside. It is good to hear." She paused. Then she wrote, "I think what happened is that we were always going to go out here. The question was just whether we would fix our problems first or bring them along. We ended up doing it sort of at the same time." She paused again. She wrote, "I think that might be why we are good at several things at once." She sent the message. Then she went to the bridge to begin the return preparations. The Vorath monitoring officer, who had been watching the Persistence for the full 6 weeks, wrote her final report on the day the ship departed. The report covered the usual things: movements, contacts, exchanges, observed capabilities. But in the final section, which was supposed to be a threat assessment, she found herself writing something different from what she had expected to write when the assignment started. She wrote, "In 6 weeks of observation, I have found no evidence of military intent, expansionist agenda, or any behavior that would indicate a threat to the hegemony. What I have observed is a small crew of 22 individuals who have, in that time, established scientific collaborations with multiple species, contributed meaningfully to several ongoing research programs, made personal connections with an estimated 40 to 60 individuals across the station, and conducted an original survey of a region we have been avoiding for 4 centuries. She paused. She wrote, "What I want to note in this report, because I think it is relevant to any future assessment we make of this species, is something I observed on the last day of the Persistence's time at the station." Commander Okafor made a final round of the station before departure. She visited each person she had a working relationship with and said goodbye in person, not through a message. In person. She thanked each one individually. She gave some of them copies of data from the mission. She told several of them she hoped to see them again. The monitoring officer stopped writing for a moment. Then she wrote, "I have watched many departure ceremonies in my career. I have watched powerful delegations leave important meetings, and junior diplomats leave first assignments, and old allies part, after long joint operations. The way Commander Okafor said goodbye to 43 different beings across 4 hours was unlike any departure I have seen. It was not a performance. She was not managing impressions. She simply did not want to leave without saying goodbye to each of them specifically, because to her, each of them was a specific person she had met and valued." She paused again. She wrote, "I am filing this in the observations section, rather than the threat assessment, because it does not bear on threat assessment. What it bears on is something else." She thought for a moment about what word to use. Then she wrote, "It bears on what kind of civilization this is going to be, out here among us." She stopped. She wrote, "I think the answer to that question is the kind that remembers your name." She filed the report. The Persistence had already gone. So, Part 5. The Persistence arrived home 7 months after it left the Keth station. The return trip was quieter than the outbound journey in some ways, and louder in others. Quieter because there was less uncertainty. They knew the route, they knew the ship's rhythms, they knew what the bubble drive felt like at 80% and 60%, and the particular way it hummed when the calibration was slightly off on the port side. Louder, because 22 people who had spent 6 weeks in one of the most significant events in human history had things to think about and talk about, and the ship was not a large ship, and they were in it together for 7 months. Okafor had given a brief address to the crew on the first day of the return journey. She had said, "What we did out there was real. It happened, and it will not unhappen. In a few months we are going to be back on Earth, and there will be a lot of noise about what it means, and what comes next, and who gets to decide. And I want you to remember that we were there. We saw it. We know what it was actually like, which is going to be different from what anyone who wasn't there will say it was like. Hold on to that." The crew had listened and nodded, and gone back to work. Dr. Mehta spent most of the return journey writing. She was finishing the language paper, extending it now with 6 weeks of additional data. She was also writing a personal account of the mission, not for publication, just for herself. She wrote about the Shul scientist she had talked to about deep-time communication, which was the Shul's term for the way messages passed between civilizations across very long stretches of time. She wrote about the young Mern researcher who had cried, by the Mern standards, which was a particular vibration in the air around them that their biology produced when they were moved. When she had shown her the Persistence's sensor readings from the Drek Nebula, she wrote about what it felt like to hear her own language from someone who did not share it natively, to hear the Keth diplomat try out English phrases that Meta had taught her as a courtesy. She wrote, "I came out here expecting something extraordinary, and that is what I found. But the ordinary parts were the best parts. The conversations that happened because two people were in the same place at the same time, and both happened to be curious. Those are the parts I am going to remember." Chief Engineer Marcus Webb spent most of the return journey with the drive system, which was, after 11 months of outbound travel and 6 weeks of local operation, and now the return trip, beginning to show the kind of wear that required attention. He fixed what he could fix, and noted what he could not, and prepared a detailed report for the engineering team back home that was equal parts proud and honest. Proud because the system had worked. Honest because he knew how close some of the margins had been. He thought about the expression on Sarah Chen's face when he told her the drive had been built in 12 years. He had been telling the truth, but he had left something out, which was that built in 12 years also meant it had needed to be rebuilt several times in those 12 years, as they found out what did not work, and why, and what worked better. The engineering of the thing was the story of figuring it out while doing it, which was the only kind of engineering that happened fast. He did not find this embarrassing. He found it accurate. He thought, when the next ship is built, it will be better. When the one after that is built, it will be better again. That is how this goes. He thought, we are going to get very good at this very fast. Earth received the Persistence with the kind of welcome that only happens once. The arrival was broadcast globally, which meant that approximately 6 billion people watched it in some form, live or replayed or summarized in a way that made it possible to understand in 10 minutes what had taken 6 weeks to actually happen. There were ceremonies. There were press events. There were committee hearings in several national and international bodies about what the contact meant and what should be done next and who was responsible for various things. Okafor attended the ceremonies that were required and testified at the hearings that were necessary and answered the questions of the journalists who were accredited and managed to get through most of it with the same quality of patient directness she had brought to everything since leaving home. The questions people asked her were different from the questions the aliens had asked her. The aliens had asked, "How did you get here? What are you looking for? What do you know? What can we share?" The people back home asked, "Are they dangerous? Are they friendly? Do they want something from us? What does this mean for us?" Okafor answered all of it. The aliens were not dangerous in any way she had identified. They were friendly in ways that were sometimes different from what humans meant by friendly, but that were genuine. They wanted exchange, which was not the same as wanting something from you. What it meant was that humanity was not alone, and that not being alone had implications that would take time to understand. She said this in various forms many times to many different audiences. What she could not say, in the hearings and the press events, was the thing she actually thought, which was that meeting all those people out there had made her feel more human, not less. Not in a competitive way, not in a we are better way, but in the way that you understand yourself better, when you are seen by someone who does not know you yet. The Keth and the Vorath and the Shul and the Mern and all the others had looked at humanity from the outside, without the layers of assumption and habit that made it hard to see something clearly when you had always been inside it, and what they had found, seen fresh, was something she was still trying to articulate even to herself. She thought, they thought we were remarkable. Not because we were perfect, because we kept going. She held on to that. 6 months after the Persistence returned, Earth launched 14 more ships. They were different from the Persistence. Better in some ways, built with the knowledge the Persistence crew had brought back. Slightly different designs based on what had worked and what had not. The drive systems were more stable. The hull plating was more uniform. 3 of the ships had experimental communication arrays that were designed to maintain contact with the Keth station across interstellar distances, which the Persistence had not had. They were also, viewed from outside, still clearly human ships. They had the same quality the Persistence had, the look of things built by people who were doing their best, and had gotten very good at it, and were continuing to do so. They were not polished the way the Herald-class ships were polished. They were ready. The Keth Consortium received a message from Earth 3 weeks before the launch, informing them that a second human expedition would be departing and giving the planned routes and objectives. The message was formally worded and covered all the necessary information, and at the very end, included a note from Okafor, who had been asked by the Mission Planning Office to add a personal line to the official communication. Her note said, "We are sending more people. They are good people. I think you will like them." Saris Chen read the note and read it again. She drafted a response that was warm without being unprofessional, and sent it. Then she called a meeting with her diplomatic team and said, 14 ships. We need to start thinking about this differently. This is not one contact. This is the beginning of a relationship, and we should treat it as such. Her team agreed. They got to work. One of the 14 ships was called the Uns Ridiculous Optimism. The crew had named it this themselves, which was not standard procedure for naming vessels, but the Mission Planning Office had decided, after some internal debate, that it was fine, and had officially registered the name anyway. Several people on the Oversight Committee had found this funny. Several others had found it alarming. The person who had chaired the naming debate had written in her notes that it was, in her view, the most accurately named vessel in the history of the space program. The Ridiculous Optimism's mission was the boundary zone that Okafor had arranged access to. The route took it through Vorath space, which meant a checkpoint and an inspection at the edge of Vorath-administered territory. This was agreed in advance, and the Optimism's commander had been thoroughly briefed on the protocol. The Vorath lieutenant who boarded the Optimism for the inspection was 22 years old. His name was Varkes, and he had been in the monitoring corps for 14 months, and this was only his third boarding inspection. He conducted the inspection correctly, checking all the relevant systems and verifying all the relevant documentation. He was professional throughout. At the end of the inspection, he was supposed to return to his own vessel, file his clearance report, and that was that. Instead, he stayed for 4 hours. He stayed because the Optimism's crew had invited him to stay for what they called lunch, which was the midday meal. He had accepted, partly out of professional curiosity, and partly because the crew member who invited him had done so with such genuine warmth that declining had felt like it would have been rude. He ate their food, which was very different from his own food but not unpleasant. He talked to the crew. He talked to the mission specialist who was going to be running the boundary zone survey. He talked to the chief engineer, who had very strong opinions about a modification she had made to the drive calibration, that she was fairly sure her supervisors did not know about. He talked to a junior crew member named Lena Park, who was 21 years old and on her first mission, and who asked him more questions about the Vorath hegemony in 4 hours than he had answered in the previous 14 months combined. He returned to his own vessel with the clearance report and filed it correctly. Then he sat at his desk for a while. Then he wrote a message to the Vorath Diplomatic Corps, requesting information on how to transfer from the monitoring corps. His commander, who had watched the inspection from the Optimism sensor feed, approved the transfer request before it had officially been processed. She knew why. She had been thinking about the same thing for different reasons. Thought in long arcs watched the 14 ships depart on the Shul's long-range sensors. She watched them spread out across different routes toward different destinations, like a hand opening. 14 small lights moving outward from a single point, moving with the same steady, unhurried pace that the Persistence had moved with, going where they were going because that was where they were going, without apparent concern for whether it was allowed or possible, or what anyone else thought about it. She watched them for a long time. The eldest of the Shul Council, the one who has waited, found her at the observation array and sat with her. He did not speak for a while. He watched the same lights she was watching. Eventually he said, "I have been reading the message you sent me." She said, "I sent it some time ago." He said, "I have been reading it carefully." She understood this. Carefully, for the Shul, meant going over something until you were sure you had found everything it contained. He had been doing that with her message about the humans for 6 months. He said, "You think they are significant?" She said, "I do." He said, "In the way you wrote about." She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There have been others who arrived the way they arrived. You said this in your message. You referenced the old records." She said, "Yes." He said, "The ones in the records are gone. Their descendants are here, but they are not the same as the ones who arrived." She said, "I know." He said, "What happened to them?" she said. They changed things. And then they settled into the things they had changed. And then after a long time they became part of the pattern, instead of the thing that disrupted it. She paused. She said, I think that is what happens. Eventually. He said, how long is eventually? She considered. She said, for the ones I know of, a few thousand years. He nodded slowly. He said, and in those 1,000 years. She said, everything is different. They sat together watching the lights of the 14 ships move outward across the sensor field, moving toward the Vorath space and the Keth stations and the boundary zone, and all the other places that the galaxy held, which were many. Moving toward the beings who lived in those places, and who were, right now, going about their lives without knowing that 14 small lights were on their way. Thought in long arcs, thought about what it was like to meet someone new, really new, the kind of new that changed your understanding of what was possible. She thought about how the Shul had experienced this with other species over the long years, and how each time it had changed something, made the universe feel larger and more populated than it had felt before, made her understand the Shul themselves differently, through the eyes of the new. She thought about Okafor saying she hoped they would be good neighbors. She thought, yes, I believe you will be. The Persistence itself was retired from deep space service after the return. Not decommissioned, not dismantled. Retired. There was a difference, and the people who made the decision about what to do with it understood the difference. It was moved to the Earth Space Heritage Site, a large facility in low orbit that had been built to house historically significant vessels. It had a place there now, among the first ships, the ones that had carried humans beyond their own planet for the first time. Okafor attended the ceremony. Most of the crew attended. They stood on a viewing deck in the facility and watched the Persistence be moved into its berth, and the ship looked the way it had always looked, slightly asymmetrical, hull plating uneven in places, unmistakably the work of people who had built the best thing they could with what they had. Someone had bolted a small plaque to the hull near the main airlock before the move. Okafor had not ordered this, and did not know who had done it. The plaque said, in plain letters, first. She thought about taking it down. It seemed too small a word for what the ship had done. Then she thought, maybe that is the point. After the ceremony, she stood at a viewport in the facility and looked out at the stars for a while. They looked the same as they always had. The same cold, steady lights. She had grown up looking at them, and she had looked at them from the bridge of the Persistence across 4.3 light-years of empty space, and she had looked at them from the Keth station, while Saris Chen talked about what a galaxy full of civilizations felt like from inside it. They looked the same. She knew they were not. 14 months after the Persistence returned home, the first message came back from one of the new ships. It was from the Second Chance, which was the vessel that had taken the longest outbound route to a region of space that the Keth charts marked as unexplored. The message contained survey data, a record of initial contact with a species that had not previously had contact with any other civilization, and a personal note from the commander that said simply, there are more of them out here. A lot more. Everything is fine. Tell Dr. Mehta the language situation is very interesting. Okafor read this message in her office at the Mission Planning Center, where she now worked between missions. She read it 3 times. Then she went to the planning office and began reviewing the schedules for the next wave of ships. There were 6 more in preparation. 2 of them were ready ahead of schedule. She made a note to see if the departure windows could be moved up. The stars outside the window of the planning center looked the same as always. There was a lot of space out there. She got back to work. Vethkor was promoted 6 months after the Persistence returned home. His promotion came partly because of the quality of his research during the contact period, and partly because of a long paper he had written about what the Sol 3 secondary survey layer meant for how the Keth understood the development of spacefaring civilizations. The paper had circulated widely through the consortium's academic networks, and had started a debate that was still ongoing. The debate was essentially about whether the Keth's existing model of civilizational development was broad enough, or whether the humans were an anomaly that required the model to be revised. Vethkor's view was that the model needed revision. He wrote this carefully and with extensive evidence. He argued that the Keth had built their understanding of how civilizations developed based on the civilizations they had encountered, which were all, to varying degrees, civilizations that had developed in relatively stable conditions. Stability had been treated as a prerequisite for expansion. His argument was that the humans demonstrated this was not always the case, and that a model which treated it as a requirement was missing something. What it was missing, he wrote, was the possibility of a species that developed not because things went well, but in spite of things going badly. A species that found a way forward not by solving its problems first, but by going forward at the same time as it was dealing with them. He did not know if this was reproducible or unique to the humans. He thought it was worth finding out. The paper was well received in some quarters and sharply challenged in others, which in his experience was what happened when a paper said something true that people did not want to be true yet. He was not discouraged by the challenges. He read them carefully and responded to the strongest ones and learned from the ones that found genuine weaknesses in his argument. Science, as his mentor had told him early in his career, is the process of being wrong in increasingly specific ways until you are right. He thought the humans would appreciate this definition. He wrote to Dr. Mehta and shared the paper with her. She wrote back a long reply that engaged with several of his arguments in detail and offered 3 observations that he had not considered and that he subsequently worked into the paper's revised version. She ended her message with a sentence that he saved and returned to several times over the following months. She wrote, "I think you are asking the right question, which is not what kind of civilization are the humans, but what does the existence of the humans tell us about what is possible?" He thought, yes, that is exactly the right question. He did not know the answer yet. He thought he might spend the rest of his career looking for it, and he found that this was not a discouraging thought. It was the opposite. Arriaga went on the second mission. He had not planned to. He had completed the first mission and returned home, and there had been a period of several months where he had been back in his ordinary life, in the city where he had grown up, visiting his family, adjusting to the fact that he had seen things that most people in the city had not seen, and that the city was still the same city. He went back to work at the space program in a support role, and he thought about the second mission and decided he did not need to go. Then he thought about the Keth maintenance worker and the informal gravitational chart the cargo pilot had given him, and the MERN researcher who had cried at the sensor data. He thought about standing at the observation port on the Persistence, looking at the stars, and knowing there were people in them. He applied for the second mission 6 weeks before the application window closed. He was assigned to the ON's patient journey, which was going to a region of space the Keth described as the outer quiet, a part of the galaxy with fewer stars and fewer known inhabitants than the areas the first wave of ships was covering. The name made it sound like a less interesting destination. Arriaga, who had learned something about what interesting looked like from the outside, thought this probably meant it was very interesting, and nobody had been paying close enough attention. He told his grandmother before he left. She was very old now, and she did not always remember things, but she always remembered him. He told her he was going back out there. She held his hand and said, "I knew you would." He stayed with her for an afternoon, and they talked about the things she used to tell him when he was small, about the universe being too large to be empty, and he told her it was true. She had been right, and the look on her face when he said this was something he was going to remember for the rest of his life. He left on a Tuesday. The patient journey's drive engaged smoothly on the first try, which was a better start than the Persistence had had, and the ship moved out of Earth's orbital space with the steady hum of systems that had been built by people who had already done this once and knew better now. Arriaga sat at his environmental station and watched the readouts, and felt the familiar presence of a ship working around him, the small sounds of 24 people living in close quarters in an enclosed space, moving through the dark. He thought about the outer quiet. He thought about what was in it. He started a new log entry. It said, "Day 1. We are going somewhere nobody has been. I don't know what we will find. That is the point." He closed the log and checked his systems and listened to the ship hum. Outside, the stars were steady and very far apart, and full of things that nobody knew about yet. He was going to go find out what they were. This was, he had decided some time ago, the best possible use of a life.